Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in suburban Georgia, and I'm standing in my grandmother's backyard watching 15 million gallons of federally protected wetland water cascade through Karen Whitmore's $2.3 million McMansion like God's own fire hose. The woman who spent 3 years calling me boy and trying to steal my family's land is now screaming from her second-story window as her Italian marble floors buckle under the weight of Mother Nature's justice. But let me back up and tell you how we got here, because this story, it's got more twists than a Georgia back road, and I promise you've never heard anything quite like it. My name is Darius, and I spent 12 years as a federal agent with the DEA, working deep cover operations from Miami to Mexico City. I've stared down cartel bosses, survived 3 assassination attempts, and once spent 47 days living in a Colombian jungle, eating nothing but plantains and regret. But none of that prepared me for what I'd face when I came home to inherit my grandmother's house in the suburbs of Atlanta. You see, my grandmother, Essie Mae Washington, was the kind of woman who could make Sunday dinner for 12 people appear out of thin air and shame the devil himself with just a look. She raised me after my parents died in a car wreck when I was 8, and that little house on Magnolia Drive was the only real home I'd ever known. When she passed at 93, she left me everything. The house, built in 1952 with her own hands alongside my grandfather before he shipped off to Korea. The 3 acres of land that backed up to what most folks thought was just a swampy area behind the subdivision, and most importantly, something I wouldn't discover until much later, water rights that dated back to a Reconstruction-era federal treaty. The funeral was on a Thursday. By Saturday, I was standing in the driveway of that little yellow house, duffel bag in hand, thinking about how I was finally going to have some peace after years of living out of hotels and safe houses. That's when I met Karen Whitmore. Picture a woman who looks like she fell face first into a Nordstrom catalog and somehow absorbed the entire thing. 54 years old, blonde hair that cost more than most people's cars, and the kind of tennis outfit that screams, "I peaked in high school but married well." She drove up in a pristine white Range Rover, because of course she did, and stepped out wearing enough jewelry to fund a small country's GDP. The smell of her perfume hit me before she even opened her mouth, something floral and expensive that probably cost $200 an ounce. When she walked, her tennis bracelet caught the morning sunlight like some kind of suburban warning beacon. "Excuse me," she said, not bothering to introduce herself. "Are you the new owner?" I set down my bag and extended my hand. "Darius Washington, just inherited the place from my grandmother." She looked at my hand like I was offering her a dead fish. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Magnolia Grove Homeowners Association. We need to discuss some issues with your property." The way she said issues made my skin crawl. It had the same tone I'd heard from dirty cops and corrupt politicians throughout my career. That particular blend of condescension and barely concealed hostility that immediately puts you on alert. "What kind of issues?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Years of undercover work had taught me to read people fast, and this woman was broadcasting hostility on every frequency. She pulled out a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Multiple violations. The paint on your shutters is 3 shades off the approved color palette. Your mailbox is non-compliant. It's 6 inches too tall according to our architectural guidelines. The landscaping is completely unacceptable, and don't get me started on that fence." I looked at the house my grandmother had lovingly maintained for 70 years. The fence she was pointing at had been there since before most of the subdivision existed. The landscaping was nothing but the natural Georgia vegetation that had been growing there since Sherman marched to the sea. "These violations have been accumulating for years," she continued, flipping through page after page of official-looking documents. "The total fines come to $43,000. $43,000 for paint colors and plants that were older than she was. "Let me see those," I said, reaching for the folder. She pulled it back like I was going to steal it. "The HOA has been very patient, but patience has limits. If these violations aren't corrected within 30 days and the fines paid in full, we'll have no choice but to place a lien on the property." I felt something cold settle in my chest, the same feeling I'd get right before a cartel meeting went sideways. "This house has been in my family for 70 years. My grandmother never mentioned any HOA. Karen's smile could have frozen hell over. "The HOA was established in 1995 when the developer purchased the surrounding land. Your grandmother's property was grandfathered in, but that doesn't exempt it from current community standards." She handed me a business card that probably cost more to print than most people spend on lunch. 30 days, Mr. She paused, making a show of not remembering my name. Washington, welcome to the neighborhood. As her Range Rover disappeared down the street, I stood there holding that manila folder like it was a live grenade. This was supposed to be my retirement, my chance to finally settle down somewhere that felt like home. Instead, I was apparently at war with someone who looked like she'd demand to speak to the manager of Oxygen itself. That night, I sat on my grandmother's porch swing, the same one where she'd taught me to read, where we'd shelled peas and talked about everything from girls to God to why good people sometimes had to fight bad ones. And I called my old partner Rodriguez in Miami. Darius, please tell me you're not calling because you're already bored with civilian life. Rod, I need you to run a background check on someone. Karen Whitmore, Magnolia Grove subdivision outside Atlanta. I could hear him typing. Rodriguez was one of those guys who could find dirt on a saint if you gave him 5 minutes and a decent internet connection. Holy shit, brother. What kind of hornet's nest did you kick? That bad? Karen Elizabeth Whitmore, née Prescott, married to Councilman Richard Whitmore. That's her second marriage. First one ended when she got caught embezzling from her tennis club's charity fundraiser. 3 DUIs in the past 10 years, all mysteriously dismissed. Her husband's got connections all the way up to the state level. Rodriguez paused, and I could hear more typing. But here's the interesting part. She's been president of that HOA for 8 years, and in that time they've foreclosed on 17 properties. 17, Darius. All of them got bought up by something called Magnolia Development LLC. Let me guess, she's got ties to Magnolia Development. Her brother-in-law is the CEO. They've been systematically targeting older homeowners, hitting them with bogus fines and violations until they're forced to sell. Then the company swoops in, buys the properties for pennies on the dollar, tears them down, and builds McMansions. I felt that familiar burn in my gut, the same one I'd get when we were tracking down dealers who sold drugs outside elementary schools. This wasn't just bureaucratic harassment. This was organized theft, dressed up in legal paperwork and community standards. How many of those 17 properties belonged to black families? I asked, though I already knew the answer. 14. The other 3 were elderly white folks who probably couldn't fight back effectively. After we hung up, I sat on that porch until the sun came up, listening to the sounds of the wetlands behind the house. Frogs croaking, night birds calling, the gentle splash of something moving through the water. My grandmother used to say those wetlands were special, protected by the federal government because of some old treaty. At the time, I thought she was just talking about environmental protection. I had no idea how right she was, or how that old treaty was about to become Karen Whitmore's worst nightmare. The next morning, I drove into downtown Atlanta to visit the county records office. If there's one thing 12 years of federal law enforcement teaches you, it's that the real story is always in the paperwork. The records clerk was a middle-aged black woman named Dolores who took one look at my federal credentials and decided we were going to be friends. Honey, what you looking for? Because if it's about that HOA mess out in Magnolia Grove, you ain't the first person to come asking questions. What do you mean? She lowered her voice and leaned across the counter. That woman, Karen Whitmore, has been here more times than I can count. Always with some lawyer, always looking for ways to challenge property deeds and boundary lines. Last month, she was trying to claim water rights on properties that have been in families since before she was born. Water rights, my grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. That land behind the house, Darius, it's special. The government says so. Can you pull the original deed for my grandmother's property? S.E. May, Washington, 1247 Magnolia Drive. Dolores disappeared into the back room and returned 20 minutes later with a file box that looked like it predated electricity. Your grandmother's property is interesting, Sugar. Real interesting. The deed was dated 1952, but attached to it were several other documents that made my pulse quicken. A federal land grant from 1867, a treaty with the Creek Nation from 1832, and, most importantly, a document from the Army Corps of Engineers dated 1951, establishing the wetlands behind the subdivision as a protected federal watershed. This here, Dolores said, pointing to a paragraph buried in the legal language, says your grandmother's family was granted perpetual water rights as part of their Reconstruction-era land grant. That includes management authority over the entire watershed system. I stared at the documents. Management authority over the watershed, the same watershed that fed the retention pond in the middle of Karen's precious subdivision, the same retention pond that was controlled by a system of gates and channels that nobody had paid attention to in decades. Dolores, what happens if someone interferes with federally protected water rights? Her grin could have powered half of Atlanta. Oh, honey, that's a federal crime. Environmental Protection Agency, Army Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife Service, they all get involved, and they do not play games. I spent the rest of the day making copies and taking photographs. When I got home that evening, there was another notice taped to my front door. This one was from the city, claiming that my property was in violation of a newly passed ordinance requiring all residential structures to be connected to the municipal sewer system within 60 days. The fine for non-compliance, $15,000, plus a daily penalty of $500 until the violation was corrected. I called the city planning office. The ordinance had been passed 3 days ago. Karen's husband, Richard, had been the deciding vote on the city council. That's when I realized this wasn't just about HOA violations. This was a coordinated campaign to force me off my land, using every level of local government they could influence. They wanted my grandmother's property, and they were willing to break laws to get it. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed I was just another elderly homeowner who would be intimidated by official-looking paperwork and legal threats. They didn't know I was a federal agent who had spent years learning how to dismantle criminal organizations. The next morning, I called my old supervisor at the DEA regional office in Atlanta. Special agent in charge, Patricia Holmes, was a woman who could stare down a hurricane and ask it why it was in such a hurry. Darius, please tell me you're calling because you want to come out of retirement, because I've got a cartel case that could really use your expertise. Pat, I need a favor. I think I've stumbled onto something that might interest the federal government. I laid out everything I'd discovered, the systematic targeting of minority homeowners, the coordination between the HOA and local government, the attempt to seize federally protected watershed property. Send me everything you've got, she said. This sounds like it could be a RICO case, racketeering, conspiracy, civil rights violations, under color of law. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at federal felony charges for everyone involved. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same law we use to take down organized crime families and corrupt political machines. The same law that carried sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. I was starting to get that old feeling again. The thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of building a case that would stand up in federal court. Karen Whitmore had picked the wrong veteran to mess with. That afternoon, I was in my backyard examining the old watershed control system when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Karen approaching with 2 men in expensive suits. "Mr. Washington," she called out, "I'd like you to meet my attorney, James Peterson, and my husband, Councilman Richard Whitmore." Peterson was the kind of lawyer who probably charged $600 an hour to tell people why they couldn't do things. Richard Whitmore looked like every corrupt politician I'd ever seen, soft, entitled, and wearing a smile that never reached his eyes. "Gentlemen," I said, not bothering to shake hands. Karen was dressed for another tennis match, but her usual smug confidence seemed strained. "We're here to make you a very generous offer. Magnolia Development is prepared to purchase your property for $400,000, cash, closing in 2 weeks. $400,000 for 3 acres, in one of Atlanta's most desirable suburbs, property that should have been worth at least twice that much." "That's very kind," I said, "but I'm not interested in selling." Richard stepped forward, and I could smell the bourbon on his breath even though it wasn't even noon yet. "Son, you need to understand something. This community has standards. We've invested a lot of time and money into making this one of the premier neighborhoods in the metro area." The way he said "son" made my hands clench into fists, the same tone cops used to use when they pulled me over for driving while black, back before I learned to flash my federal credentials fast enough. "We're trying to help you," Karen added. "The legal fees alone for fighting these violations will cost you more than the property is worth. This offer represents a clean slate, a chance to start fresh somewhere more suitable." Suitable. There was that word again, loaded with all the implications they couldn't quite say out loud. Peterson cleared his throat. "Mr. Washington, my clients are prepared to increase their offer to $425,000, but only if you accept by Friday. After that, we proceed with the lien process and foreclosure proceedings." I looked at the 3 of them standing in my grandmother's backyard, the place where she'd taught me to garden, where we'd had barbecues every 4th of July, where she'd told me stories about my grandfather and great-grandfather and all the Washington men who had worked this land for generations. "Let me ask you something," I said. "What happens to the wetlands when you develop this property?" They exchanged glances. Karen's composure cracked just slightly. "The wetlands will be properly managed according to all environmental regulations. Peterson said carefully. You mean you'll drain them and build houses on top of them? Any development will be fully compliant with local zoning ordinances, Richard added. But he was sweating now despite the cool morning air. I smiled, not a friendly smile. The smile I used to give drug dealers right before we kicked in their doors. Gentleman, lady, I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll keep my family's land. And I think I'll have a conversation with the Army Corps of Engineers about those wetlands you're planning to develop. The color drained from Karen's face. Peterson grabbed her arm and whispered something in her ear. Richard's political smile disappeared entirely. You have until Friday, Karen said, but her voice had lost its authority. After that, we move forward with foreclosure proceedings. As they walked away, I heard Richard hiss at his wife, You didn't tell me about any federal wetlands. It's just swamp land, she shot back. Nobody cares about some old treaty. That's where she was wrong. The federal government cared very much about old treaties, especially when they involved water rights and protected watersheds. The next day, I drove to the Army Corps of Engineers office in downtown Atlanta. The building was one of those imposing federal structures designed to remind people that the United States government was serious about its business. Colonel James Morrison was exactly what you'd expect from a career Army engineer: precise, thorough, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to following federal law. When I showed him the documents from my grandmother's deed, his expression grew increasingly grim. Mr. Washington, what you're showing me indicates that your family holds federal water management rights over a Class A protected watershed. These rights supersede any local zoning ordinances or HOA regulations. He pulled out a detailed topographical map of the area. This entire system, he said, tracing the waterways with his finger, feeds into the Chattahoochee River. It's protected under the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the original federal treaty that established these water rights. What does that mean practically? Morrison's smile was sharp as a combat knife. It means that any attempt to interfere with your water rights or to develop the protected watershed without federal approval is a federal crime. It also means that as the holder of these water management rights, you have the authority to control water flow through the entire system. Water flow control. I thought about the retention pond in the middle of Karen's subdivision, surrounded by million-dollar homes built in what used to be a natural floodplain. I thought about the system of gates and channels that managed water levels throughout the area. Colonel, what would happen if someone opened all the watershed gates during, say, a heavy rain event? His grin grew wider. Well, Mr. Washington, that would depend on whether the person doing so had the legal authority to manage water flow in that system. Someone without that authority would be committing a federal crime. But someone with legitimate water management rights? They'd simply be exercising their legal prerogatives to manage their federal trust lands. I left the Corps of Engineers office with a folder full of documentation and a new appreciation for the foresight of whoever had written my family's original land grant. They had given us not just property, but power. The power to control the very water that Karen's subdivision depended on. That evening, I walked the old channels behind my house with a new understanding. My grandmother had been right. This land was special, but it wasn't just environmentally protected. It was a loaded weapon pointed directly at the heart of Karen Whitmore's corrupt little empire. The weather forecast for the following week showed a major storm system moving in from the Gulf of Mexico. Heavy rains, possible flooding, the kind of weather event that tested every drainage system in North Georgia. It was time to test whether Karen's precious McMansions could handle a little natural water management. Friday came and went without me accepting their offer. By Monday morning, there was a lien notice on my door and a new round of violation citations. They had charged me with operating an illegal septic system, maintaining non-compliant landscaping, and my personal favorite, operating a residence in a manner inconsistent with community standards. That afternoon, Karen showed up with a sheriff's deputy and a man in a hard hat. Mr. Washington, the deputy said, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, I have a court order authorizing the disconnection of your electrical service pending resolution of outstanding HOA violations. The man in the hard hat was from Georgia Power. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Ma'am, he said to Karen, I need to tell you, this is highly unusual. We don't normally disconnect service over HOA disputes. The court order is very clear, Karen replied, waving a piece of paper. This property is in violation of multiple community standards and poses a health and safety risk to the neighborhood. I examined the court order. Judge Harold Whitmore, Richard's brother, had signed it that morning. Deputy, I said, I'd like to make a phone call before you proceed. He nodded. Small-town cops usually knew when they were being used in someone else's political game. I called Special Agent Holmes at the DEA office. Pat, they just showed up with a court order to cut my power. I think it's time to make some federal noise. Give me 20 minutes, she said. While we waited, Karen paced back and forth in my driveway like a caged tiger. The Georgia power technician sat in his truck, clearly hoping this would all resolve itself without his involvement. 23 minutes later, 2 black SUVs pulled up, and my day got significantly better. Special Agent Holmes stepped out of the first vehicle, followed by agents from the FBI and Environmental Protection Agency. From the second SUV emerged Colonel Morrison and 2 federal marshals. Ms. Whitmore, Agent Holmes said, I'm Special Agent Patricia Holmes with the Drug Enforcement Administration. We need to discuss some financial transactions involving your HOA and Magnolia Development LLC. The color drained from Karen's face faster than water through a broken dam. Colonel Morrison, Army Corps of Engineers. Ms. Whitmore, I believe you've been interfering with federally protected water rights and planning unauthorized development of a protected watershed. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The sheriff's deputy took one look at the federal badges and quietly retreated to his patrol car. This is harassment, Karen finally managed to say. I'm simply enforcing community standards as authorized by— Ma'am, one of the FBI agents interrupted. We're going to need to examine all HOA financial records, correspondence with Magnolia Development LLC, and communications with city council members regarding zoning changes and special ordinances. That's when Karen did something that confirmed everything I suspected about her character. She looked directly at me and said, "This is all his fault. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. People like him should stay where they're supposed to be. People like him." The federal agents exchanged glances. In the space of one sentence, Karen had just added federal civil rights violations to her growing list of problems. Agent Holmes smiled, not a friendly smile. "Ms. Whitmore, I think we need to continue this conversation at our office." As they led Karen away in handcuffs, yes, handcuffs, right there in front of all her neighbors, she was still shouting about property values and community standards, and how this was all a misunderstanding. The Georgia power technician approached me with a relieved expression. "Sir, I think there's been some confusion about this disconnect order. Everything looks good with your service." That night, I sat on my grandmother's porch swing and called my old partner Rodriguez. "Brother, you are not going to believe what's been happening up here," I said. "Try me. After 12 years of working with you, very little surprises me anymore." I told him about the federal agents, Karen's arrest, and the growing investigation into what the FBI was now calling a systematic conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights under color of law. Damn, Darius, you really kicked over the whole anthill, didn't you? Rod, it gets better. Remember those water rights I mentioned? Turns out I can control the flow of water through the entire subdivision's drainage system. There was a pause. Please tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. The weather forecast shows heavy storms all week, and as the federally authorized manager of this watershed, I have certain responsibilities to ensure proper water management. Darius, completely legal, Rod. Colonel Morrison from the Corps of Engineers explained it to me himself. I'm just exercising my federal water management rights. The storm hit on Wednesday night, not just rain, a biblical deluge that would have made Noah nervous. By 10 o'clock, the Weather Service was issuing flash flood warnings for the entire metro area. I put on my rain gear and walked out to the old watershed control system behind my house. The channels were already running high, and I could hear the roar of water moving through the underground culverts that fed the subdivision's retention system. The control gates hadn't been opened fully in decades. My grandmother had always kept them partially closed to maintain water levels in the wetlands during dry seasons. But tonight, with Federal Water Management Authority and a moral obligation to test the system's capacity, I had every legal right to open them completely. The sound of the gates opening was like a dam bursting in reverse. Instead of holding back water, I was releasing the full power of a protected federal watershed into a drainage system designed to handle normal, suburban runoff. By 11 p.m., water was flowing down Magnolia Grove's pristine streets like a river. By midnight, the retention pond at the heart of the subdivision had overflowed its banks. By 1 a.m., Karen Whitmore's McMansion was taking on water at a rate that would have impressed the Titanic. From my grandmother's porch, I had a perfect view of the chaos. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights, expensive cars floating down streets like toy boats, and the sound, oh, the beautiful sound, of entitled suburbanites discovering that Mother Nature doesn't respect property values. The next morning, the subdivision looked like a war zone: soggy McMansions with buckled floors and ruined furnishings, flooded luxury cars that would never run again. And right in the middle of it all, Karen Whitmore's house, the crown jewel of entitled suburban excess, sitting in 3 feet of muddy water, like a very expensive, very waterlogged monument to hubris. The best part, according to federal law and the Corps of Engineers, I had done nothing wrong. I had simply exercised my legitimate authority to manage water flow during a significant weather event. The fact that the subdivision had been built in a natural floodplain without proper consideration for federal water rights wasn't my problem. It was their problem, a very expensive problem. The local news crews arrived by noon. Channel 5's weather guy kept talking about unprecedented flooding in an area that had never experienced significant water issues before. If he had bothered to check the historical records, he would have discovered that the area flooded regularly until they built the retention systems that depended on the watershed controls I had just exercised. By Friday, the insurance adjusters were arriving. That's when the real fun began. See, insurance companies don't pay out for acts of God during natural disasters if the flooding was caused by pre-existing water management issues or inadequate drainage planning. And when federal investigators started asking questions about whether the subdivision had been built in compliance with federal watershed protection requirements, the insurance companies got very interested in very detailed investigations. Karen made bail on Monday morning and immediately called an emergency HOA meeting. I didn't attend. I was too busy meeting with reporters from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who were suddenly very interested in the story of how a racist HOA president had tried to steal a federal agent's family land and ended up flooding her own neighborhood. But several of my neighbors did attend, and they were happy to share what they heard. She stood up there, soaking wet and covered in mud, screaming about how this was all your fault, Mrs. Patterson from down the street told me. Said you had somehow sabotaged the drainage system. Mrs. Patterson was 83 years old and had lived through everything from the civil rights era to the Trump administration. She had no patience for Karen's particular brand of suburban racism. Then what happened? Well, that's when Tom Bradley stood up, the retired engineer who lives over on Oak Street. He's been doing his own investigation of the flooding. Tom Bradley was one of those detail-oriented guys who probably had blueprints of the subdivision memorized. If anyone would figure out what had actually happened, it would be him. Tom had all these maps and charts, Mrs. Patterson continued. He explained how the whole area used to flood regularly before they built the retention systems, and how those systems were designed around specific water flow rates from the federal watershed. She paused for effect, clearly enjoying the story. Then he asked Karen if she had bothered to research federal water rights before she started her little harassment campaign against you. You should have seen her face, honey. She turned about 6 different shades of red. The meeting had ended with Karen storming out and several homeowners demanding her resignation as HOA president. By Wednesday, a majority of residents had signed a petition calling for new leadership and a complete audit of HOA finances. That audit turned up some very interesting information. Agent Holmes called me Thursday morning with an update. Darius, you're going to love this. Karen and her brother-in-law have been running a beautiful little scam. The HOA pays Magnolia Development for community improvements and architectural consulting services. Magnolia Development then kicks back 30% to a consulting company owned by Karen's husband. How much money are we talking about? Over the past 5 years, nearly $2 million, money that was supposed to go to actual community maintenance and improvements, but instead went into their pockets. $2 million in embezzled HOA fees. Added to the civil rights violations, the conspiracy charges, and the environmental crimes, Karen was looking at spending the next 20 years in federal prison. But the universe wasn't done with Karen Whitmore yet. The IRS arrived the following Monday. I was working in my grandmother's garden, which was now officially designated as restoration of natural habitat in a federally protected watershed, when I saw the government cars pull up to Karen's water-damaged McMansion. Agent Sarah Chen from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was the kind of person who could find hidden money in a Swiss bank account using nothing but a calculator and sheer determination. Mr. Washington, she said, introducing herself over my fence, I wanted to thank you for bringing this situation to federal attention. The financial crimes we're uncovering go far beyond what we initially suspected. It turns out that Karen and her husband had been using the HOA as their personal piggy bank for years. Unauthorized withdrawals for vacations disguised as community relations trips, HOA funds used to pay for Karen's tennis club memberships under community outreach expenses, even their daughter's college tuition, which they had somehow categorized as educational consulting fees. The total theft appears to be in excess of $3 million, Agent Chen continued. We'll be seizing assets to recover the stolen funds, including the house, vehicles, jewelry, and investment accounts. $3 million from an HOA that was supposed to maintain streetlights and organize the annual block party. By Friday, Karen's house had federal seizure notices taped to every door and window. Her Range Rover was gone, towed away by federal marshals. Even her precious tennis bracelet, the one that had caught the sunlight so brilliantly during our first meeting, was now evidence in a federal tax evasion case. The final blow came from an unexpected source, the Magnolia Grove homeowners themselves. It turns out that when you flood people's million-dollar houses because of your own corruption and stupidity, they tend to get litigious. A class action lawsuit filed by 63 affected homeowners was seeking $37 million in damages for the flooding, property destruction, and financial losses caused by Karen's mismanagement of community resources and failure to maintain proper watershed coordination. $37 million. Even if Karen wasn't heading to federal prison, that kind of civil judgment would have destroyed her financially for the rest of her life. The cherry on top came when Judge Harold Whitmore, Richard's brother, the same one who had signed the court order to cut my electricity, recused himself from all cases involving the HOA after the FBI started asking uncomfortable questions about his family's financial interests in Magnolia Development LLC. 6 months later, I was standing in my backyard watching a team of environmental scientists from the University of Georgia conduct a biodiversity survey of the restored wetlands. The flooding had actually improved the ecosystem, washing away years of suburban runoff and allowing native plants and animals to return to areas that had been artificially drained. Dr. Patricia Williams, the lead scientist, was practically glowing with excitement. "Mr. Washington, this is remarkable. We've identified 17 species of native birds, including 2 that were thought to be locally extinct. The water quality has improved dramatically, and the natural flood control system is working exactly as it was designed to." The natural flood control system, my grandmother's wisdom, encoded in federal law and family tradition, had turned out to be more sophisticated than any modern engineering could improve upon. Karen Whitmore was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison for racketeering, conspiracy, civil rights violations, tax evasion, and environmental crimes. Her husband Richard resigned from the city council in disgrace and was sentenced to 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. Magnolia Development LLC was dissolved by court order, with all assets seized to pay restitution to the defrauded homeowners. The new HOA president, elected unanimously by the remaining residents, was Mrs. Patterson, the 83-year-old who had lived through everything and had no patience for anyone's nonsense. Her first act was to officially recognize my family's federal water rights and establish a community fund to help with wetland restoration. Her second act was to eliminate all the bogus architectural requirements that Karen had used to harass homeowners. "Honey," she told me at the community barbecue we held to celebrate the new leadership, "the only community standard we need is treating people with basic human decency. Everything else is just paperwork." I still live in my grandmother's house. The little yellow house that Karen Whitmore tried so hard to steal now sits at the center of a federally protected watershed, surrounded by restored wetlands that serve as a natural flood control system for the entire area. The house itself has been designated as a historical landmark, not because of its age, but because of its role in exposing one of the largest HOA fraud cases in Georgia history. I've been asked to speak at law enforcement conferences about the case. The Department of Justice uses it as a training example for identifying civil rights violations disguised as bureaucratic harassment. The Environmental Protection Agency includes it in their courses on federal water law enforcement. But my favorite part of the whole story happened last month, when a young black couple with 2 kids looked at the house next door to mine, the one that used to belong to one of Karen's co-conspirators, before it was seized by the federal government. "Is this a good neighborhood?" the wife asked me, clearly nervous about moving to an area that had been in the news for racial harassment. I looked around at the restored wetlands, listened to the sound of birds that had returned after decades of exile, and thought about my grandmother's wisdom echoing through federal law and family tradition. "Ma'am," I said, "this is exactly the kind of neighborhood where good people are supposed to live. And anyone who doesn't think so can take it up with the federal government. They moved in 3 weeks later. Their kids love playing by the wetlands, and they've never received a single HOA violation notice. The old retention pond where Karen's house used to sit has been converted into a community garden, native Georgia plants, vegetables for anyone who wants to tend them, and a small memorial plaque that reads, "In memory of Essie Mae Washington, who understood that some things are worth protecting." Every morning I sit on my grandmother's porch swing with my coffee and listen to the sounds of the wetlands, frogs croaking, birds singing, and the gentle flow of water through channels that have been protecting this land for longer than any of us have been alive. Sometimes I think about Karen Whitmore, sitting in her federal prison cell, probably still trying to figure out how a simple land grab turned into the complete destruction of her life. I hope she's had time to reflect on the difference between community standards and basic human decency. But mostly I think about my grandmother's wisdom. She always told me that the land would take care of us if we took care of it. She was right about that, just like she was right about everything else. The water rights that saved my family's home weren't just legal documents. They were a promise that some things are more important than money or status or the color of your skin. A promise that justice, like water, always finds a way. And sometimes when the morning light hits the wetlands just right, I swear I can hear my grandmother laughing, that deep, joyful laugh she used to have when she watched me figure out something important on my own. She knew all along that the real treasure wasn't the house, or the land, or even the water rights. It was the lesson that when good people stand up to bullies, when they use the law the way it was meant to be used, justice doesn't just win, it floods the whole damn neighborhood. Last week I got a call from a veteran in Michigan whose HOA was trying to force him out of his family farm. The pattern was familiar: bogus violations, escalating fines, coordination with local government officials who had financial interests in developing his land. "Sir," he said, "I heard about what happened down in Georgia. I was wondering if you might have some advice." I smiled, thinking about Rodriguez and all the other agents I'd worked with over the years. How we'd always said that the best part of taking down one criminal organization was using what you learned to stop the next one. "Son," I said, "the first thing you need to do is get down to your county records office and pull every document related to your property deed. And I mean every document, going back as far as they have records. What am I looking for? Water rights, mineral rights, easements, federal land grants, anything that might give you leverage under federal law instead of local ordinances. These HOA scams work because they count on people not knowing their rights under federal law." We talked for 2 hours. By the time we hung up, he had a plan. More importantly, he had hope. That's the thing about justice. It's contagious. Once people see that it's possible to fight back and win, they start fighting back everywhere. The Magnolia Grove case has inspired similar investigations in 6 states. The Department of Justice has established a task force specifically focused on HOA-related civil rights violations. The FBI now has a dedicated unit that does nothing but investigate corrupt homeowners associations, and the Corps of Engineers has started a program to help property owners understand their federal water rights, because it turns out there are a lot more Essie Mae Washingtons out there than anyone realized. People who held federal land grants and water rights and mineral rights that they didn't even know about. People whose families had been protecting important natural resources for generations without realizing the power that gave them under federal law. Karen Whitmore thought she was picking on some old black lady's grandson who wouldn't know how to fight back. Instead, she awakened a sleeping giant that's been systematically dismantling corrupt HOAs across the country. There's a lesson in that, I think, about what happens when people who think they have all the power run into people who actually understand how power works. 6 months ago, I thought I was retired. I thought I was done fighting the good fight and ready to settle into a quiet life in my grandmother's house. But it turns out that once you've spent your career learning how to take down criminal organizations, it's hard to ignore when one sets up shop in your backyard. And it turns out that the skills you learn as a federal agent, attention to detail, understanding of legal systems, ability to build cases that will stand up in court, those skills are just as useful against suburban criminals as they are against drug cartels. Maybe more useful because suburban criminals are usually so arrogant and entitled that they don't bother covering their tracks very well. Karen Whitmore kept detailed records of everything she did, every illegal payment, every civil rights violation, every coordination with corrupt officials. She documented it all. because she never imagined that anyone would have the knowledge or authority to challenge her. That's the thing about privilege. It makes you sloppy. It makes you think you're untouchable right up until the moment you discover that you're not. I've been invited to speak at the DEA Academy about the case, not because it involved drugs, but because it's a perfect example of how organized crime principles apply to all kinds of criminal enterprises. The same techniques we use to map drug distribution networks work just as well for mapping HOA corruption networks. The same financial investigation methods we use to trace money laundering work perfectly for tracking embezzled community funds, and the same patience we learned for building cases against cartel bosses, the willingness to gather evidence methodically, to let criminals hang themselves with their own actions, to wait for exactly the right moment to move. That patience serves you well when you're dealing with corrupt suburbanites who think they're above the law. The best part is that unlike cartel bosses, corrupt HOA officials usually don't know when they're under investigation. They just keep committing crimes in broad daylight, creating more evidence, making your case stronger. Karen Whitmore spent 3 years harassing me and documenting every moment of it. By the time the federal agents arrested her, she had created a paper trail that would have impressed a mob accountant. 3 banker's boxes full of evidence, all of it organized by date and violation type. It was like she was building the prosecution's case for them. That's what happens when people who think they're clever run into people who actually are clever. These days, I spend my mornings tending my grandmother's garden and my afternoons consulting with federal agents who are investigating similar cases around the country. It's good work, important work, the kind of work that makes you feel like you're still serving your country, just in a different uniform. And every evening, I sit on my grandmother's porch swing and listen to the sounds of the wetlands she protected, thinking about how she would have loved to see Karen Whitmore in handcuffs. "That woman needs to learn some manners," she would have said. And it looks like the federal government is going to teach them to her. My grandmother always said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. She was right about that, just like she was right about everything else. Sometimes it just takes a little help from the Army Corps of Engineers. So that's my story. That's how a DEA agent's retirement got interrupted by a racist HOA president who didn't understand federal water law. That's how a simple inheritance turned into a masterclass in why you should never underestimate someone just because they don't look like what you think power is supposed to look like. And that's how my grandmother's wisdom, encoded in federal law and family tradition, ended up flooding out the corruption that had been poisoning our community for years. If you're dealing with a corrupt HOA, or if you know someone who is, remember this: local bullies are usually just that, local. But federal law is federal. It applies everywhere, to everyone, all the time. And if you happen to be a veteran or federal agent who's facing harassment from people who think your service doesn't count because of what you look like, remember this too. You didn't serve your country so that some entitled suburban tyrant could steal your family's land. You served your country so that justice would be available to everyone, including you. Sometimes you just have to remind people of that fact. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Have you ever dealt with a corrupt HOA? Did this story give you any ideas for fighting back? And if you're a veteran facing similar harassment, know that you're not alone. There are resources and people ready to help. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about justice prevailing over entitlement. And I'll see you in the next video, where I'll be telling you about the time a Navy SEAL inherited a ranch in Texas and had to deal with an HOA president who thought she could intimidate a man who used to hunt terrorists for a living. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well for the HOA president. Until next time, remember, justice is like water. It always finds a way.